TE Talks with Guides is a weekly podcast for lovers of history, travel, and all things Italian. Welcome back to TE Talks. This is Rob Allen. Hello, everybody. Here I am doing our wonderful podcast where we are going to have lovely conversations with many of the guides who work with Through Eternity Tours and sometimes even staff members. Today, we have a great guest. We have Thomas joining us. Hey, Thomas.
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno. How are you today?
Doing all right. I'm liquored up, so.
Oh, that's good. I am now, of course, an ambulance is driving by the office, but we'll just keep it in. It's fine. Could you hear that? Did you hear the ambulance?
Yeah.
Oh, well,
That's right. We're in a city.
Yeah, we're going to be going through the city. So today, I am so excited to talk to you about the Grand Tour. But first of all, let's just give an introduction for yourself. I know we've done a pre-recording of from Charlemagne in the Middle Ages, which will eventually come out, but we're going to be doing this one first. So tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, and how long have you been working with Through Eternity Tours?
Well, I've been in and out of Italy for 30 years. I've lived in Rome now for the last 15, but I'm originally from Central Florida, which is where I started studying history. And then I continued studying history in France, where I also studied art history, and then wrapped things up at the archaeology department at La Sapienza, Rome's 700-year-old university. But the whole 15 years that I've been here in Rome, I worked with Through Eternity. I set up the interview before I left the States. I was living in New Haven at the time, and arrived here, and the rest, as they say,
is history. There we go. Yeah, I very much remember your interview with us. I even think I talked about in the last podcast about Caravaggio and the red cloth that would go through with Judith and Holofernes. But I will always say, I think that you have a great gift of being a storyteller and being able to take an immense amount of history and weave it in with different stories of characters in a way where I was like, well, got to bow down to Thomas because he just does this so beautifully, which I think has always helped because you get also into the philosophy and the ideas of things. You go into you go into like a profound deepness, which doesn't turn people off at all. In fact, it gets them very much engrossed in it. I mean, you're not just trying to spark people's imaginations. It's like you've opened up a book and they kind of fall into this story that you create for people. And I think if anybody kind of looks at TripAdvisor, they can see a lot of how they really enjoyed what you've done. And that is why, a time period that I find very, very interesting that, we kind of touch upon a little bit when we're doing tours, but I thought it would work really well for you. And that's why I invited you to create a grand tour, virtual tour that we have online about Rome, which of course is going to cover some of the beautiful fountains and piazzas of Rome. So I kind of wanted to talk about it so that people can get an idea. With these virtual tours, they've been so wonderful because they really allow us to recreate with images and live storytelling what things were like, and we can get to be specialized with them. So how did you find getting that challenge, like realizing it? What was it like for you when I said, oh, Thomas, can you do this for me? Were you happy, or were you like, oh gosh, what am I going to do?
Am I supposed to be honest?
Yes. We're getting to the truth here.
Because you had suggested, to do something that kind of features the Spanish Steps and the Trevi Fountain. And my first thought was, good idea, because there's interest, because generally the people are interested in the things that they already have some familiarity with, something that they've heard of, they know of. So, there's an easy, quick connection, and then they'll learn a lot more. But that first connection with something that they've seen or heard of or aware of. But my second thought was, what am I going to say for an hour on the Spanish Steps and the Trevi Fountain? I mean, usually finding enough to say is not my problem, but I thought I still need to be interesting, engaging, informative, and the more I began, I thought, well, like anything else, start digging,
Hmm.
start looking, and start thinking about how I would organize it. And as I began taking those steps, I kind of thought, well, both the Spanish Steps and the Trevi Fountain, just as sort of poles, anchors on either end of this particular geographic area, come from the same period of history. A period of history that was certainly English-speaking world, um, known in Rome as the time of the Grand Tour. Now it extends earlier than that as well, but really the 18th century and into the very early 19th century was kind of the height of that.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's when I thought, well, let's organize it in that way. Could have Then I was able to sort of create a triangle within a geographic triangle within the city, with Piazza del Popolo in the north, and then the Spanish Steps in the southeast, and the Trevi Fountain in the southwest of that particular triangle. The neighborhood itself dates to an earlier time. I mean, they start laying out the plan in the early 16th century.
Hmm.
And so much of it is really built up, besides some fabulous palaces and monastic installations and churches in the 16th century. Much of it is actually built in the 17th century. And then this kind of really corresponds to the dramatic rise of international tourism, for lack of a better word.
Sure.
And it's Queen Elizabeth I who really starts that, who decides that her young aristocratic noblemen, and I do mean young, I'm talking in the early 20s, many of them, uh, needed to get them some culture on the continent, and even supported by their own family money, but also even by government funds, sent off for not months, but even years at a time,
Hmm.
uh, as young men, to explore. Principally, the idea was the ancient ports of call along the Mediterranean, and the idea was it all culminated in Rome. And so that's already beginning in the very late 1500s. And then the French follow suit, and then it becomes even larger. The Germans and the Dutch and the Poles and those from the Baltic states and Scandinavia. So it became
Fascinating.
quite a big a phenomenon, really. And it was in this neighborhood that most of those people stayed for their time in Rome. And we're talking people who were spending 9 months or longer in Rome alone. So they weren't just renting. They weren't just renting a room. They were renting a flat, or sometimes even more space
Of
than that.
course, they were bringing their servants with them as well.
Yeah,
I just want to give a little sidebar to this because you started out with very interesting. I mean, I'm already engrossed what you're saying. I never realized about Queen Elizabeth, of course, being kind of the catalyst of this. That's fascinating to me. Very helpful for me when I'm going to be doing tours. But aside from that, just as a sidebar, yesterday with a marketing meeting with Connor and Pips and Dylan, that Connor apparently said that he always had to warn Pips whenever he puts on a regular basis, we have photographs of the Trevi Fountain. Why? Because they get the most traction out of anything. So they get the most comments. Now, one of the jobs that Pips is doing is responding to people. So she has to be ready to invest a large amount of time because we also get an enormous amount of comments
yeah.
on this thing. Even though people have seen it again and again, it's just so dramatic to people. Now, I love the fact that the concept of the Grand Tour is kind of the glue together, and also Piazza del Popolo. I love that you are starting there because that's one of my favorite places as a starting point in Rome. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I
It's
bet
what most people saw first. The
exactly it was
vast
the way
majority of
to get
people were
through.
coming into those northern gates.
I bet, once you then started to think about it, you said to yourself, how am I going to talk about these things for an hour? And then I bet you probably were thinking, how am I going to be able to fit all this in within an hour?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so please continue. Let's say you have the nobility. Oh, and another thing, for me, before even coming to Europe, I loved merchant ivory films. I'm
Yeah.
sure you're familiar with,
Room with a view,
A Room with a View, of course. And I
where
also
angels fear to tread.
where Angel Tread, but Morris for me, of course,
Oh yeah.
was a
Yeah. Yeah.
big deal. I remember, oh
Yeah.
gosh, the actor, who was it? He was in Four Weddings and a Funeral. Oh God, you know who I'm talking about.
Well,
He's
it's
very
Simon Callow.
Not Simon Cowell, no. Yeah, he's the
but the
guy who
other guy, the
died.
younger guy,
Yeah. Oh God. No, this
I'm looking at his face.
Hugh Grant. Hugh
Yeah.
Grant. Yes. Anyway, Hugh Grant, he was getting himself into trouble, having a relationship with a man. And so he goes off on his grand tour and they show him walking by temples, of course, with this lovely Panama hat. And, I mean, that really kind of sparked my idea of getting to go to Italy as well. It's kind of the whole fascinating thing that the British, were making jokes about it. Maggie Smith's like, well, don't worry, if we can't find him a husband in Downton Abbey, she's saying, there's always nobility in Italy. We can always get her married off to some Italian noble, so there was this kind of
Enchanted
idea.
April is another one.
Oh yeah, and I mean, a lot of these were really big in the '90s,
Yeah.
and then I ended up moving to Italy in 1997. So yeah, I mean, this romantic idea as well goes back into it. But let's get back on track. So continue. Talk about like entering into Piazza del Popolo or walking down the Via Flaminia to get there.
And it's a really dramatic entrance. And keep in mind, for most people traveling like this, they'd already been on the road for a couple of years, at least. I say on the road that I don't mean, under hardship. They're,
Mhm. No,
they're traveling quite comfortably and staying for extended period of time in the various places
not the
they're
pilgrims. Yeah.
they're going. Then arriving in Rome, then the Via Flaminia, this ancient road that connects basically Rome to Rimini on the
Mhm.
Adriatic coast. One of the principal grand old highways from ancient times leading into in and out of the city. Then right up at the northern gate, which leads into Piazza del Popolo, you walk this enormous square. Now it's this massive elliptical space, and it's only been like that since the Napoleonic era, about 200
Sure.
years ago. Before there was kind of trapezoidal, still an enormous urban space.
Hmm.
Uh, and you walk into this space, you've got two churches that are not exactly twin. They're close enough to be fraternal twins, if not necessarily identical. And then this massive obelisk in the middle. That's the first great one brought back from Egypt during the reign of Caesar Augustus
Hmm.
2,000 years ago, and it's been standing in the middle of that square since the very late 1500s. So you walk in; it's a theatrical setting. It's like walking into the welcome center at Disneyland. I mean, you know that you're someplace special, like as though the vicar of Christ himself is ruling. Well, that's exactly the case. The vicar of Christ on earth, the Pope, was indeed ruling because Italy, for most of the last 1,500 years, is not a country. It's a peninsula with a bunch of countries on it, one of which is the Papal States,
Hmm.
the whole central third of the Italian peninsula. Rome's the capital, the Pope's the king. You walk into this space and you know exactly who's in charge. And that it is a place that is different to any other place on earth. That's certainly the idea, and much of the sort of gusto and confidence that comes with the great growth of the Renaissance, economic growth, political growth, and really the rise of what we end up calling the papal monarchy.
Hmm.
Uh, and all of this is represented in architecture and the rational plans of Renaissance urban design imposed on a city that is nearly 3,000 years old. But you just recycle the space and you cut through things. And in that case, in that whole northern part of town, it was sheep and goats and cows and vineyards and olive groves, with the main drag of what in ancient times, all called Via Lata,
Hmm.
which becomes Via del Corso,
Hmm.
uh, uh, in in the Renaissance, in the mid 1400s, becomes the scene of a horse race that takes place every evening of Carnival, which is that whole week of events leading up to Ash Wednesday, and the kickoff, you know, Fat Tuesday, Mardi Gras,
Yep.
and then Ash Wednesday, which kicks off the 40 days of Lent. And every evening of that week of Carnival, you had this Barbary horse race, and now since then Via del Corso, I mean Racetrack Street.
Mhm.
And as as people were traveling across their 2, 3 years, they had very well established itineraries. And keep in mind, this wasn't travel for pleasure, this was travel for formation. Young aristocratic men, initially women come later on too, but young men and women, they learn to dance. Why? Because it's fun? No, because gentlemen and ladies are expected to know how to dance.
Mm.
It's that kind of travel. They've got a list of things to see and do. They have to keep travel journals, and they're traveling with academic masters, with tutors, basically,
Sure.
and often traveling in small groups. And uh, they would plan many of their stops around local folk festivals,
Mhm.
Le Sagre, for example. So if I'm thinking of Santo Stefano di Sessagno, a small town up in the mountains, lentils, they do lentils. And every year when the lentils are gathered, they have the festival of the lentils, and you eat lentils that are coming out of your ears for a week. But each of these different places, whether it's the feast of their patron saint, or the blessing of whatever their agricultural product is, uh, you have festivals that go along with that, and all of these travels were sort of geared to take as much advantage as possible as those kinds of festivals. People wanted to make sure that during Carnival they were in Rome. Interesting now because Venice is the big draw for Carnival,
Mm-hmm.
but until the late 19th century, Rome was the place that most people wanted to be for Cardinal. Uh, no offense to Giovanna.
Yeah. She does
Probably
do a
from
virtual tour about the
Venice.
carnival, but yes.
But Rome was the place that they wanted to make sure that sometime during their stay in Rome, Carnival was happening while they were here.
What a lost opportunity. I always think about that because it seems like, you read about it, was such a huge deal.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
was started by the Venetian Pope, Paul II. But it
At
was
least in that sort of the iteration that it became best known for. And the Barbary horse race was one of the principal elements of that. Well, in the late 19th century,
Mhm.
those were, because it was like the running of the bulls in Pamplona and just as dangerous. They just outlawed it.
Mhm.
And that kind of was the death knell for Carnival in Rome. It's never been the same since. We
Wait,
have
who
mayors
outlawed
every
it?
once in a while that try to bring it back.
It doesn't come out as that. Who outlawed the horse race though? I didn't hear that part.
The king, Victor Emmanuel the second,
Oh, blah
the
blah.
first
Okay.
king of United Italy. Yeah.
What a pain. Okay, well, okay, so great. So we've established the first place that we're in. You've done a great job describing for us Piazza del Popolo, and you've also done a great job of like touching on aristocrats that are coming through. Let's say the English, the Germans, the French, etc. Now, there's something else that I've always had difficulty. So I'm gonna hopefully have you explain for me why this is, because I kind of have my own bourgeois idea of certain things. We have the aristocrats, and then you also said that there was kind of the entourage that would go with them, because we also talk about the romantics, okay, the romantic period, which is very much coincided with the grand tour. And we talk about one of the greatest writers of the German language, Goethe, or we talk about Lord Byron or John Keats,
Yep.
Percy Shelley, these writers, these poets. Now, my idea, of course, is like, oh, we always have the struggling writers, struggling artists, dying of tuberculosis. And I always got the idea that they were poor. So is it that they were joining these aristocrats, or else they were not
Oh,
poor?
they were not poor.
They were not poor.
No, no, no. John Keats came from a wealthy family. Lord Byron is, well, Lord
Mm.
Byron. Shelley was from a fairly well-to-do family as well. Shelley and Keats, not aristocracy, but
Well
from
enough to.
fairly well-off families nonetheless. Well-educated, they're gentlemen,
Mhm.
even if they're not nobility. And they didn't always travel. These people wouldn't always travel with sometimes few attendants. Most of the time, the help was arranged where they were going. So you'd have to travel with a few, essential staff.
Mhm.
In Rome, in particular, they were famous for kind of the English in particular for buying packaged deals,
True.
uh, which included their lodging, uh, chef, service staff, culinary staff, uh, carriage and liveried attendants at their beck and call 24 hours a day. And those were all here. Sometimes they would travel with their own photographer, painters. More often, they hired them here. And there were people who made their name and were famous, were well known amongst those particular traveling circles. And so, oh, you absolutely must have so and so when you go to have your portrait done at Rome. And 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 they would often have them uh, mostly pre-done. So you see these images of Lord Byron sort of lounging dramatically with the Colosseum behind him, or Byron with a friend as they're looking out surveying things in the distance with the same view of the Colosseum, because the view of the Colosseum is the view of the Colosseum, and they have them all pre-painted, and all the painter has to do is basically Photoshop the individuals in.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's a business.
It's like
It's a
Edward
business.
Gibbon's lying on a column for the decline and
Yeah.
fall of the Roman Empire. Yes.
All right, and the best known of the portrait artists in Rome was Pompeo Battoni.
Huh?
And this guy's born in 1708. So in the 18th century is when he's actually already starting in the 1720s. And for decades was the go-to guy, most especially for the well-to-do Brits who were traveling in Rome, having their portrait done.
So he was probably able to become pretty wealthy.
Yeah.
I never knew this, man. So he could charge if he's going to get the aristocrats with supply and demand, right?
That's right.
Lovely. Didn't know
Did
that.
quite well for himself. Yeah.
Gosh. Okay. So then we're going to have to try to find a self-portrait, not a self-portrait, some kind of portrait, if there is one, of Pompeo Bottoni.
Oh yeah. There's certainly portraits of stuff that he's done, portraits that he's done, people in various settings in the homes in which they were staying.
Mm-hmm.
And you even find some, most especially that, like really famous one. I use a few of them in my grand tour.
Mm-hmm.
One particular one of Goethe with his distinctive bone white overcloak,
Yes.
as he's sort of lying with bits and pieces of ruins around him, and the mausoleum of Cecilia Metella in the background. Basically, he's posing right exactly where my apartment is.
Really?
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's how you
Yeah.
figured it out. Okay, so that's
Yep.
great. That's
Yeah.
insane. Just for people who are listening, just so you guys know, what's a wonderful thing, what we're doing is that we are filming this conversation on Zoom. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to insert images of things that we're talking about. So then you can go subscribe on our YouTube channel and then take a look. You can even go through it quickly, but just fast forward and you're going to see these figures, these people we're talking about, these places that we're seeing. So I'm already like thinking in my mind, looking, having fun, really searching for those images of the carnival, the horse races, this artist that we're talking about, and all these portraits. But let's get back to the story. How about and there's so many funny things, interesting things that we could talk about with. We have a limited time, but I'm thinking, okay, obelisks. I'm going to talk to Luca, our local Egyptologist, to talk about the obelisks, or I think the tridents of Rome, meaning the streets. The most famous one being the one from Piazza del Popolo, and the 3 streets that form a trident, but there are other ones. But let's just say, so from Piazza del Popolo, going down the Via del Babuino, they get to Piazza di Spagna. So tell me a little bit about that area and what the piazza was, what it looked like, and who was staying there.
So if you're at Piazza del Popolo with the gates behind you and you're looking down at the largest of the tridents, with Via del Corso, that racetrack street that runs right down the middle. That's been the main drag through the middle of the town since way before Julius Caesar. And then you got the one that goes over to the west, right to the riverbanks, and near the mausoleum of Caesar Augustus. And then to the east, right at the base of the kind of running along the base of the Pincian Hill, is Via del Babuino. And you have a few things that sort of mark English presence. Keep in mind that when the Pope is the king, Protestant churches don't exist in Rome. It's only when the Pope loses his country during the process of unification of Italy, and Rome is the last of the great cities to fall to the unionizing forces in September of 1870. Just a few months later, the Americans, the small American colony here, they build a church, an Episcopalian church,
Yes.
the first non-Roman Catholic church in Rome. And of course, the English was like, damn. So right away, they build one. And those two churches both exist. The American Episcopalian Church is St. Paul within the walls,
Hmm.
and All Saints in Via del Babuino, and it sticks out like a sore thumb. Where you have these fabulous earth-toned stuccoed buildings from the 16th and 17th centuries for the most part, and then this big rusty red brick building with very Northern European kinds of spires. And the inside is a real blend of dark woods, but also marbles and polychrome stones and elements with round arches. So you get a real mixture of something that is quintessentially recognizably English,
Yes.
and at the same time making sure that you know that you're in Rome. I think it's such an incredible space where they've used architecture and interior design to create a phenomenal sense of place. But the fact that it's in that particular neighborhood reflects the fact that that neighborhood was where most English people stayed. Again, it's where most everybody else stayed too, but they're, relatively speaking, the English in particular, and the rest of Britain as well, and most particularly, the Scots, and more than, but most famously and most recognizably, the English, and their representation in Rome was disproportionately high. So you had, the Dutch and the Scandinavians and everybody else, but there were so many English people living in that neighborhood for extended periods of time all throughout the year,
Hmm.
that even the English called it the little English corner of Rome. And right on Piazza di Spagna, on Spain Square, with all those English people, why is it called Spain Square? Well, because the Spanish embassy is on one end of that piazza, which is still the Spanish embassy to the Holy See.
Yes.
On the other end of the square, as you're facing the steps, which in fact are paid for by the French, built by Italian builders, and the Spanish get the name. They didn't do anything, but their embassy is there. Casanova, when he first arrives in Rome from
Mm.
Venice, which, keep in mind, at that time is a separate country, the Republic, the most serene Republic of Venice, whereas this was still the Papal States down here. But he's hosted by a Spanish cardinal who's effectively serving as the ambassador of Spain to Rome. And he's 20 years old, gets kicked out because he gets caught harboring a runaway teenage girl in his rooms. Oops.
Oh dear.
So yeah,
Does, I guess.
as you do.
Mhm.
But later in life, when he's back in Rome, well established now,
Mhm.
he stays in what was the most exclusive hotel in the city, and it's where the Diesel store is now. So as you're facing the steps, off to the left of me, there's Babington's, and then there's that little road, Via del Bottino, which goes straight to the metro.
Yep.
The
Yep.
building that's right on that corner,
That
not
was
in
the
the
most
building
prestigious hotel. Wow.
that was the most prestigious hotel in Rome. Yeah.
That's interesting. That's fascinating. Do you know I actually performed in the Anglican Church. It's All Saints, and
Yep.
I was with the
With the,
vicar, I guess, who was in charge. Yeah, we did a performance of Much Ado About Nothing in
oh,
the church
nice.
itself. Oh my gosh, yeah, it was about 2000.
But they regularly host operatic arias, groups that do
Mhm.
arias from operas, as does St. Paul Within the Walls as well. Both of them do. All
Yeah,
three.
I mean, they are fascinating churches, both that and St. Paul's Within the Walls. St. Paul's has that wonderful mosaic by
Uh,
the
and I love it. And
notes.
not everyone's a fan, but I really like, in general, pre-Raphaelite
Mm.
work. But
Yeah.
I understand this is all coming out of what's called the Oxford movement,
Hmm.
one of a few names for it,
Hmm.
coming out of the second half of the 19th century, young noblemen and well-to-do and coming out of Oxford,
Mhm.
with this idea that the Anglican Church had thrown out the baby of mystery with the bathwater of papism. They didn't want the Pope back, but they kind of resurrect this kind of nosebleed, high liturgical, late medieval idealized drag. Uh, and these glorious neo-Gothic structures
Mhm.
in especially industrial cities of the north, where people led such difficult, often drab, hard existences, but gave them liturgical beauty, that they could go in and feel part of something magnificent and gorgeous. And there was music, and a lot went into that. And that's still so much a part of that particular tradition. And I mean, I often say, put me into 1,000-year-old church, or at least one that looks like one,
Mhm.
that's got a big organ, enough incense to choke a camel, and men in drag, and I am there for that show. The head comes off of my shoulders and starts floating around in the stratosphere. And places like Alsons and St. Paul within the Walls, with those spectacular pre-Raphaelite mosaics.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, they had a lot of people with a lot of money
Yep.
being invested to establish these churches. They're finally allowed to do
Yep.
it, so they're going to make a big job of it. That's interesting also how you pointed out, because I do very much, as a major in theater, I always fell in love with stages, how things are they were able to recreate in a theater, in a stage, in a black box. But then, of course, what was my great passion of Italy was the theatrics of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
rituals of the architecture, because it's not on a stage, it's not blocked in a little black box, it is everywhere you go, and I
Yep.
mean, this is such a wonderful thing, much a wonderful experience for people. I certainly talk about it on my virtual tour, with St. Peter's being illuminated twice a year with candles. I mean, this stuff goes on, and it's wonderful that we can recreate it for people by the stories that we tell. Now, let's just finish up, because we don't want to spoil it all, but let's just get, of course, to the crown jewel of our discussion today, the Trevi Fountain, which is, of course, not too far away from the Spanish Steps. Tell us about
Um, it's done the same, more or less the same time
it. Mhm.
as the steps themselves. That piazza around the Spanish Steps was deliberately left open as a meeting space. A part of that is a misunderstanding, a misreading of antiquity. In ancient times, religion was exercised in a very public fashion. These enormous gathering spaces for the throngs of people. Pantheon is a perfect example.
Mhm.
And those spaces in front of or adjacent to temples in ancient times become the piazzas of medieval Rome. And so even in this sort of Renaissance planning, and it's a deliberate reference to ancient Rome. Well, Renaissance itself, Renaissance, the French word for rebirth. Rebirth of what? Rebirth of Rome. At first in ideas, ideals, art, architecture, and then quite literally in the city of Rome itself. And they're using their own particular idealized image of antiquity to create modern Rome. And so that bizarre, lopsided, butterfly-shaped space of Piazza di Spagna
Mhm.
is deliberately left open for that purpose, for people not to do, but for people to be. The steps get built. It's a French church up on top of the hill, which is why you have money left in a will by a guy who basically served as a diplomat in Rome for a long time from France. That combined with some papal money, the steps get built and finally open up in the winter of 1725-26. And it's just a decade later
Mhm.
that they begin work on the Trevi Fountain. So these are very, very close in time. And, generalizing a little bit, maybe overstating it, but only a bit, through much of what we call Baroque, I mean, it's church triumphant. Michelangelo and Raphael are working on their masterpieces in Rome, and Martin Luther comes to town. Nobody knows who
Mhm.
he is when he arrives, but they're gonna.
Oh yeah.
6 years after his visit, he's got his 95 bullet point temper tantrum nailed to the door of a church in southern Germany. Kind of a reference point for for sparking off what we end up calling the Protestant Reformation. Europe immerses itself in a bloodbath for a century. Christian killing Christian in the name of the Christ. They all say they represent that on one side is the other. But just to pick the year 1600 as a reference point, you got a more or less Protestant Northern Europe, more or less Roman Catholic Southern Europe. Within Catholic Europe, there's revival, reform, a resurgence of pride and faith and identity, and the art and the architecture that reflect that are rather different to the idealized elegance and restraint of the Renaissance.
Yes.
Baroque, it's big, bold, powerful, majestic, emotional, dramatic, theatrical Baroque. We're right, the Protestants are wrong. We're going to heaven, they're going to hell. God's on the Pope's side, clearly. I mean, all proof's in the pudding, and it's all around us. That's a rather particular way of creating architecture. By the time you get to the 1730s, Europe's always got plenty to argue about, then as now,
Yeah,
but they weren't killing each other over religion at that point.
Sure.
And you see something returning to Roman art and architecture that had been missing for a while. Fun, joy, exuberance, and a different kind of scripture attached to it. The joy of my salvation. I am the living water. Drink from me and ye shall thirst no more. Knock, ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and the door shall be opened. My Father owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. God's got more blessing to dump on our heads than we even know how to ask for. Oh, you need a little bit of water in the neighborhood? Here, have this in the backyard of a papal palace. It's about that as much as anything else. It's so much more than even fits in the space, and it's one of the things that I hear most frequently from visitors from the first time. They've seen images of it. Maybe they've been to Vegas and seen a particular kind of image of it. What they're not prepared for is how massive the thing is compared to the space. It completely dwarfs everything around it. That the square itself had to be chopped off so they could add the pool. The square becomes basically a small, narrow little walkthrough compared to the space taken up by the pool. And it is theatrical, deliberately so. And even the seating that's around it is at least part of the idea from the very inception, even though it takes a little while to get it done. But it seems like you've got theater seating. Well, where's the show? Well, the water is the show. Sure. That's the spectacle, the water, the images, and the whole thing is a celebration of the attributes and aspects of water. From all of the iconography, the imagery, the symbolism, the allegory, the metaphor.
Exactly. I mean, the whole thing itself is a proscenium stage. It's a proscenium stage. It's almost like you could have curtains opening it up, and that the scenery rises up out of the water. Even though it's static, there is movement because of the water itself.
Oh yeah, and not only the water, they've sculpted these various kinds of rocks with something like 300 different kinds of botanical life, very carefully and accurately depicted, all carved in this travertine stone. So it almost looks like the building is growing out of the stone. Sure. It's sort of the opposite of the second law of thermodynamics, that things move from a state of order to a state of disorder. And here we have order coming out of disorder, or we have something growing out of dead stone. I mean, it is the very act of creation itself, covered in life.
That's fascinating how you point that out, because it makes me think, because in that time period, the monuments, which were getting to be more important, archaeology is not still coming in. That's in the 1800s. This is done in the 1730s. But the Colosseum and all these other ruins are covered with plants. They're covered with these things. So maybe that's an idea that's really interesting about the plants on it. I mean, there's so many fascinating details. Thank you for giving us just a little taste of it. And I'm sure people can learn a lot more about it if they want to follow your virtual tour, the Grand Tour. And that also, in this week that is all Grand Tour in the city center, because we're going to have a video being premiered on Friday, walking through the center. But we are going to also show your lovely TE Walks Live that we did on Facebook, on YouTube, about you walking from Piazza del Popolo to Piazza di Spagna, and eventually getting to the Trevi Fountain. Now, before we kind of conclude, we're going to do a new segment I mentioned to you a bit before, let's just say we are doing our TE travel tips because you guys have dealt with many, many different clients. You are also experts in travel yourselves, as we are here. So if I was going to ask you, what would you like to leave as a TE through eternity travel tip to potential travelers to Rome or Italy?
Oh, there's so many. I think one of the first that comes to mind is one that I talk about quite frequently. Leave time for nothing. And people will often say, well, I've got a limited amount of time. I'm going to plan everything to make the best use of my time. And this kind of turns them into machines, and they often regret it when they go home because then everything's just a blur. On the other hand, you've got folks who say, oh, I just prefer to kind of wing it, take it as it comes and follow my fancy. Often your fancy will lead to waiting for 3 hours in a queue. There are
Yes.
things you want to plan ahead of time. Plan your transport tickets. You don't want to say, I want to be in Florence by dinner time, and then all the trains are sold out.
Mhm.
So plan your transport ahead of time. Book your tours well in advance.
Sure.
And any events, shows, things like that. Plan those ahead of time. Purchase your tickets ahead of time. It makes it just means you spend a lot less time needlessly waiting in queues or being frustrated because you can't get in. And then in your daily itinerary, leave time to do absolutely nothing. First of all, build in long periods of time. I mean, a really long lunch, like 45 minutes. No. A really long lunch, like at least an hour and a half.
Mhm.
Build it. You're going to need the time to sit, relax, catch your breath, and enjoy what you're eating rather than just trying to get it in and on to the next thing. Uh, Build in just blank holes in your afternoons. You can use them to nap, shop, stroll, sit in a piazza and have gelato, watch the world go by, live like Romans for just a little while. Do that each day. You'll go home with not just photographs or souvenirs, but with memories and experiences. It makes a huge difference. Gives you time to sort of digest what it is that you're ingesting.
Exactly. There's always that. I always say to, tour, but also have time to relax and take it all in, to experience it, experience the meals,
Yeah.
experience walking on your own and not have everything regimented. That's a very great point, Thomas. And that's a thing that we at Through Eternity also love to help people out is planning, getting the tickets, getting the trains, making those reservations. And that's what we're here for. We love to help people out and make those arrangements because we want, their experience to be effortless and not worrisome and, have to deal with some kinds of the bureaucracy or going up to a place like the Vatican, not realizing that if you don't get your tickets, you're going to wait for an hour or two to get into a site or the Colosseum or other places.
Or dealing with the Trenitalia website.
Oh my God. Yeah, no.
Just let us do that for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Just let us do that for you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Thomas, as always, I have learned an enormous amount. I am always astounded by your ability to take so many things, the portrait artist, the liturgical sense in the creation with architecture and the joy that it would bring to people. So many different things are always so helpful for me. Very enjoyable. I know that we could talk for hours to continue this. We do have to keep this short, but it was such a pleasure. And I know that we're going to be having you back for more podcasts later on.
Great. Thanks. I look forward to it.
All right,
Thanks, Matt.
guys. Thanks again for joining our TE Talks podcast and look forward to speaking to you next week. Bye-bye.
Ciao. Arrivederci.
Thank you for listening to our TE Talks with Guides. We have a new episode every Wednesday. Please subscribe to get an alert when each podcast comes out. Rate us and tell people how you enjoyed it and share it on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. Most importantly, if you enjoyed it, send us a feedback about the show. Also, if you are curious about what some of these people and places we talked about look like, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and watch the video on this podcast where we have inserted special images for you to further enjoy the story.